Okay, here we go. You are listening to the Go Your Way podcast. From data to cloud, from AI to security, machine learning, we cover it all.
I'm Greg, this is Phoebe. There's a million options in technology.
Just go your way.
Well, welcome to the Go Your Way podcast. Once again, I'm joined by Phoebe Goh. And our very, very special guest this week is Nigel Poulton. And Nigel, I don't know exactly what title to give you. You're the author of the Kubernetes book. You do these great Pluralsight training videos. By the way, millions of views on your videos, your training videos. Absolutely fantastic. I'm seeing on social media, you're getting rave reviews from people that are dipping their toes in the water for the first time in Kubernetes and loving the experience. What do I call you? Are you Kubernetes guru?
No, absolutely not. Nigel is good enough with me. To be honest, so I have my own company, like a kind of consulting company. And whenever I'm registering for events, you know, you get like these lanyards with badges attached to them. They always want to know what your job title is. So honestly, I go through all kinds of things, like calling myself chief scientist, chief techie, chief containerholic. So honestly, call me whatever you like.
So I do have to provide a little background, some history here. You and I go back quite a few years, and I'm going to share this picture now. I believe this goes back 9 or 10 years ago. This is myself, you, Chris Evans, who a lot of people in the industry know, and Devang Panchagar. This is our recreation of the Abbey Road Beatles album cover. That Don Jennings actually took this picture, if you remember correctly.
Yeah.
He almost got hit by a car taking the picture. Yeah. He survived, we survived, but it was a great moment, just kind of a whole different world for you and I back in those days. It's a total different universe for us.
Yeah, I think you were saying before, I think when that photograph was taken, not only had I not heard of the word Kubernetes, the technology didn't even exist, nor did Docker either at the time, to be fair. So lots of changes.
Yeah, a lot. And it's so funny that in this relatively, in technology terms, short window of time that Kubernetes has come on to the tech scene, and how quickly enterprises have adapted to it. To me, it's been a really interesting evolution. And I know, Phoebe, you've dipped your toes in the water with Kubernetes as well. And I think the big question everybody has, and we repeatedly get this, is about the maturity around Kubernetes. And is it finally safe to jump in for enterprises? Is it beyond a science project right now? And I know that's a mouthful, Nigel. I mean, it's tough to summarize an entire technology in just a minute answer. But I'm curious about where you see evolution of past technologies and where Kubernetes is on the spectrum right now.
Yeah. I'll tell you what I will say, okay? So for the longest time, Kubernetes, every time there was a new release came out, it was full of super exciting, cool new features. Now, we just had Kubernetes 1.18 released a couple of weeks ago, maybe. And I think that's the 4th or 5th major version release where it's had a real feel of sort of maturity and stability. There are still some cool new features coming through, but when you look down like that list that they put of, what's gone into alpha, what's gone into beta, and what's gone into GA, it is so many things are going into GA these days that for the techie that's deep down inside of me is kind of like, I miss all of this is super cool new stuff coming. But I stick then my other hat on of the real world. And if I was wanting to deploy this to production, and I'm like, these are the kind of changes and the kind of maturity that we need to be seeing. But I don't want to sound like a shill here at all. We need to see a lot more of that maturity as well. So steps are being made, but plenty more still need to be made.
Yeah, and definitely for an enterprise, Nigel, some of the features that I know people are waiting for around things like security, making sure that these are robust, secure environments. From looking at the alpha and the beta, are there features that you're particularly excited about going through that pipeline that are going to make this really valuable for enterprise?
So what we've seen a lot of recently is a lot of maturity around the container storage interface. I don't think there was anything in 1.18, but I know that certainly in like 1.15, 16, and 17, we saw maturities there. I think just generally speaking, the overall project as well is just has more of a feel of maturity to it. Plus, then you throw into the mix like the wider ecosystem and all of the different sort of hosted cloud Kubernetes services. They take away some of the complexity. So if you were to start consuming Kubernetes from a cloud provider, you will automatically get high availability and performance and some security, but you didn't have very much control. And that's always a problem when you're an enterprise. You want a bit more control over your versions, how quickly you keep up to date and things like that. And I'm starting to see the wider ecosystem start to play ball as well by saying, okay, we give you this like sort of pre-packaged option, but now we're starting to throw at you the options for you to dial a few of the knobs yourselves as well. So I think overall it's getting just more and more mature. Now, storage is always late to the party. It's late to every party, okay? Because I think one, it's hard. And two, it's like super risky as well, right? So, if you have an application that's persisting customer data and order transactions and things like that, and you don't protect that data and look after it properly, and you lose it, then you're in like a proper world of hurt, aren't you? So I think like networking and things came along a lot earlier, and they are richer and probably more mature. Storage came to the party a lot later. It's taking steps. But I think it still has a bunch more steps to go, to be fair.
It is. You know what? I'm just going to interject right now. We've got an event on April 30th that I want to make sure that we promote. And Nigel, you're going to be keynoting it, talking about the future state of Kubernetes. And we're going to be getting into a little deeper on this. And just so everybody knows, that's April 30th at 9 a.m. Pacific. And please feel free. It'd be great to have everybody join us for that. And there's a link at the bottom of this video where to find that event and get a calendar reminder for it. But you brought up storage there, Nigel. It's kind of an interesting thing to me because as I've looked at this and talked to some of the early enterprises that have adopted, security is one of the issues that are of concern. But you mentioned storage as well. In the context of scalable and persistent storage, I mean, this is a different element, I think, for enterprises from an application deployment perspective of how they manage persistent storage. And so I think it adds a different wild card into what your Kubernetes adoption strategy looks like and how you can grow your environment. Is that a frequent topic of conversation that you're having with users?
I mean, there are so many conversations around storage and security and the overall complexity, because although Kubernetes has gotten maybe less complex, well, it hasn't gotten less complex, but we've hidden more of the complexity. But again, there's so much more that still needs hiding. So I think probably the three major challenges that people have, especially within sort of more traditional enterprises, are around the complexity, around the security, and around the persistent storage. And it's not just that Kubernetes, it's not just that it's too hard for these organizations to implement, but what you quite often get is like a traditional enterprise will have, look, for want of a better term, okay, a SWAT team that goes and grapples with Kubernetes, gets its head around it, maybe takes an application or two and deploys it with Kubernetes, does a bunch of testing, validates it for the wider organization. But then the challenge comes in, how do you push it to the wider organization? And I mean, no disrespect to anybody here when I say this, right? But people that are in a SWAT team are in a SWAT team for a reason. And they tend to be, I don't want to say more talented, but they have more skill and more drive and things like that than the wider engineering organization within a traditional enterprise. So just because a SWAT team can get their head around something and can deploy something to Kubernetes and can grapple with the complexities and, build all of the different layers of security that are still needed and build a persistent storage solution, it doesn't mean that it easily transfers to the rest of the organization. And I think that's a concept that sometimes we overlook, that like, yeah, we might get a few sort of initial deployments that are done by like your rock star engineers within your company, but that pushing it out to the wider organization, while the organization may be able to see a bunch of benefits if they can, it's still too hard on all three of those fronts. And to be honest, it's still way too hard. I'm not here to be a shill for containers or Kubernetes. Don't get me wrong. I live and breathe it and I love it. But it just has still got a long way to go. So I'm kind of hoping that the cloud vendors, the more traditional software vendors, and those sort of, well, let me just say, and I don't want to steal the microphone here too much, right? But, you know, you have a bunch of startups that come along with solutions to help, but it is so very hard for those guys to sell into like the banks and the retail companies and the pharma companies, because you've got so many hoops to jump through. So what we need in a way is like, and let me say two things about this. We need the bigger, more traditional vendors to come in because they're already at the table in these organizations, but we need them to really well on it. Times in the past that they've, I don't know, because they have a seat at the table or something, they don't always execute as well as they could. So my dream is that like we all pile in on this. We all make it better for the smaller companies, for the bigger companies. We all bring our A to it, and given it enough time, it'll be doable by mere mortals.
by mere mortals. And Phoebe, what is some of the experience that you're seeing with some of your customers? Are you seeing the same challenges that Nigel's recognizing?
Well, something I think that's really good about Kubernetes is being part of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, because that thinks about how to bring these vendors and these different players together on the neutral ground, neutral platform, where we're all looking to benefit the end user and not just trying to, everybody's trying to make a buck, but they're all kind of working together. And so I think developments like the CSI, the container storage interface, help with that, because then we all kind of work together, and rather than having different interfaces, we have sort of more common ground to talk about. So yeah, definitely I'm seeing much more adoption of Kubernetes and containers in enterprises. I think that's it is here, and it's definitely picking up. I think you made a great point, Nigel, about the SWAT team, the Tiger team that comes in and gets it done. It's how do we then translate that into the rest of the organization? And I wanted to ask, are you seeing patterns evolve, architectural patterns, or transition patterns when it comes to saying how do we productionize an app that was converted from into microservices?
Yeah, so I'm not seeing as much of that as I would like to be honest. I'm not saying it isn't out there and happening, but so many, at least, of like the larger organizations, insurance companies and all that kind of stuff, they do tend to still be in that very early stage. And like we all know, okay, they can be oil tankers, to use the common term, right? So maybe I'm expecting a little bit too much in wanting them to be further down the development and the deployment route than they are, because of course they take a very, very cautious approach. I wonder, and I don't really know this, but I wonder whether 2020 might be a better year for more companies to start taking this deeper and wider within the organization.
Do you think, though, that simplifying some of those, like you mentioned the big players, big vendors and people there, is there a place for them to kind of come in and simplify some of that because they've got the experience? Or do you think that it's knowledge of that technology and simplifying that orchestration layer is just something that's going to evolve with time?
So like, here's just one idea, right? And I'm not saying this is what should be done or whatever, but it's the kind of thing that I think might help a lot of organizations, is to have, and I don't know, Greg might get upset when I say this, but like, a hyper-converged solution, and I may butcher the term here, right? But something that is almost like a rack of, this is like, you've got Kubernetes on it, you've got your network and your networking, your storage, your compute, all of that in there as like a building block comes pre-installed with Kubernetes. You might want to layer some of your own management suite on top of something like that, but something that says to an organization, your wider engineering group, instead of them having to become experts at everything, because there's so many layers to this, is like, here is something that is, and I use the term loosely, enterprise grade, okay, because it means different things to different people. But here is something that you can put on the floor in a repeatable pattern almost, and you get Kubernetes with a bunch of best practices, architectural best practices, security best practices, things like that. Now, look, I'm just thinking of that off the cuff. That's not like...
And I'm with you there, Nigel. And having something that's more turnkey and enterprise ready, and there's a service level that comes with that, right? So you don't have to become that expert that has to turn all the knobs on the networking, on the storage, on the compute. Totally agree with you there. I mean, I think if we can get to that point, that's where we can see the real value in this. And I also, people talk about the complexity of Kubernetes. And it's kind of funny. We all follow Kelsey Hightower and others in the industry. And one of the regularly repeated concerns is revolves around the complexity of Kubernetes. I tend to roll my eyes a bit when I hear people talk about the complexities of Kubernetes, because in the same vein, if you're an AWS expert, AWS is incredibly complicated, especially when you see the services that are coming out on a regular basis, and the treadmill that you've got to be running on to keep up to date on those services. Those are also complex. Now, it's also within a controlled ecosystem, and I think that's part of the distinction of complexity, right? But is this a reflection of where Kubernetes is from a maturity perspective, or is there just a real philosophical architectural concern that Kubernetes is inherently complicated and there is no other way around it?
So let me say two things. I hope I address your question. So on the topic of Kelsey first, what I think the container and the Kubernetes ecosystem doesn't need is a bunch of shills that are out there saying it's all amazing and perfect, right? We need people that are going to say, look, this is awesome technology and it can potentially bring your business some great benefits, but let's not get carried away and pretend that it does everything and that it's not going to bring you a world of pain at times as well. So we need people, and I need to be like that, and we need to be like that, to call it how it is, okay? Otherwise, it'll never get better. I do think, though, from looking at Kubernetes history, and I don't know if you're a Linux guy that's played around with making your own kernels and stuff like that, then you'll probably pick up Kubernetes like nothing else, no problem. But maybe, and I'm stereotyping here a little bit, I shouldn't, but if you come from more of a Windows or a vSphere background or something, and you're suddenly having to dip into YAML files and command line stuff and things, you're going to find it a bit harder. So I think there's almost a beauty to the way that you're deep and involved with YAML files and things like that. But on the flip side, it makes it hard as well. So I think that almost we need a set of tooling above it that almost abstracts away some of that stuff. It will still be happening beneath the covers. But until we get that sort of abstraction, I feel like it's kind of going to be for the techies among us, which it's not the end of the world, but for it to go mainstream, especially at traditional enterprises and the likes, it can't just be for techies. It needs to be not dumbed down.
Well, it needs to be accessible, right? And you need to be able to get value out of that without having to kind of retrain your entire organization on how to adopt it. So absolutely, you're spot on.
Yeah, I think it needs to be simplified, and something that someone told me once was, we need to make sure that these projects have sensible defaults. And I said, well, that sounds great, but defaults for a two-man shop building the next Facebook, and Facebook themselves are very different. So how do we then set some sensible defaults that suit the wide needs of the community? And so I think simplifying is one of those ways. Orchestrating and kind of abstracting some of that would also help.
Absolutely. Well, we need to wrap up. And real quick, I just want to mention again, we've got the event on April 30th. It's titled Ready, Set, Scale for Kubernetes. And we're looking forward, Nigel, to your keynote presentation. We're going to be able to dip our toes a little bit into Astra. We're going to have a community engagement around some of the challenges we just talked about with Kubernetes and how enterprises are addressing those. So thank you so much, Nigel, for being on this podcast. How can people stalk you online if they want to dig deeper and get into some of your Pluralsight classes and other things? Is there a simple way that people can follow you?
Yeah, so I would say the easiest thing is, so I'm always around on Twitter at Nigel Poulton. My website is nigelpoulton.com. So just reach out to me, either of those avenues. I don't know when this podcast will go out, but Pluralsight is currently free for the rest of April. So it's a great time, if you're unsure about whether video training is the thing for you, you don't want to part with your cash, is understandable. Get yourself on there during April, and it's free, all of my courses.
Yeah, and it's absolutely fantastic, Nigel. Like I said, there have been lots of comments on social media, LinkedIn, on Twitter, and other things about the quality of your Pluralsight videos. You also regularly, when we have face-to-face KubeCons, you do your Kubernetes 101 trainings and other things that have been very well received. And, of course, the book, the Kubernetes book, which we'll be giving out electronic versions for free at our event on April 30th. So, Phoebe, make sure you register for one of those free ebooks.
Oh, I love me some swag.
It's fantastic. Phoebe, how can people find us online and leave great reviews for us?
We are also on Twitter at GYW Podcast. We post there regularly. So follow us. And also we are on Apple, iTunes, Spotify, and anywhere you find good podcasts. So please leave a 5-star review if you are listening to us.
Yes, fantastic. This is great. Looking forward to the event on the 30th, Nigel. Thank you again, Phoebe, and thank you for everybody for tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Ciao.